Hello guys, and welcome to the final Hellfire Citadel Mythic Guide by Method. I'm Reggie Brown, and with me, as always, Just Wait.
Hey everyone.
So it's finally here. This is it. Last boss, big bad boy Archimonde. It's a pretty interesting fight, even though this fight has a lot of phases, or you could say mini phases as well. It's not that complicated, and you can easily progress from the start till the finish by getting down these small phases one by one. So don't get too intimidated. The fight is pretty long, but you'll get handsomely rewarded if you manage to beat this boss.
Yeah, this fight can be quite a mess compared to the heroic version of this fight. The abilities only change a little bit, but these changes actually make a big effect on the whole fight. Setup for this fight doesn't change that much. You just want to run 2 tanks, 4 healers and 14 DPS. Now for the tanks there's no special requirements, same as the healers. But for the DPS you want to take some cleave and dot classes that can take care of the ads that are going to be spawning in the fight. Now before you actually pull the Archimonde fight, you want to put up some ground markers to assign positioning before the fight even starts. First of all, you want to have markers to know where the boss is going to be moving, and secondly you want to have the markers up so the raid knows where to stand in certain phases. Now as you can see in our video, we are using these positions for our tactic. If you feel like you changed your own tactic a little bit, you're free to adjust the markers if needed. On the pull, we first pull the boss towards the green triangle and right next to the moon. This will ensure that the pillar is going to be spawning right where the boss is, and the Doomfire will be spawned towards the entrance.
Yeah, so as you pull the boss, you're obviously into phase 1, and we're gonna split this fight into 3 main phases. And then phase 1 and phase 2 have part A and part B, let's say. So at the start, you pull the boss, you're in phase 1. The abilities that the boss is going to be casting is, first of all, the Doomfire, which is like the most important ability in this phase, and you need to handle it as good as you can if you want to make your life easier for the rest of the fight. So what does this Doomfire do? It spawns the Doomfire Spirit, which is just a ball, and it will fixate on a random ranged player and spawn a trail of fire, green fire, chasing towards him. The difference between heroic Doomfire and mythic Doomfire is that the trail of fire that is left behind, if someone steps into it, you actually soak the fire. You take the fire inside of you, let's say, instead of heroic where you just take a debuff which just deals some damage but the fire still stays on the ground. Now, anyone who soaks this fire from the ground gets the same debuff just like in heroic, which has a 15-second duration, but again, they've also soaked the fire from the ground. And once that debuff expires, depending on how many stacks of this fire he has soaked, the same amount of stacks of fire will spawn at his location when the debuff expires. Now, the amount of stacks that Doomfire spirits will spawn is actually dependent on how long they stay alive. So the longer the Doomfire Spirit stays alive, the more fire it will leave behind, which you do not want to have, and we'll get to it when we explain the next ability. Now, the minimum stacks that you can get from one Doomfire Spirit is 10. You cannot get less. So even if you instantly kill it, it will still leave 10 fire patches underneath it. Cannot avoid that. But if you don't kill it fast enough, you might get more than 10 stacks. That is what you want to prevent. So as soon as it spawns, you need to instantly nuke it, get the 10 stacks. If you manage to get 10 stacks per Doomfire Spirit, that's golden. That should be your goal. You should feel good about yourself. Now, moving on to why would you even want to soak the fire from the ground? Well, the reason why you want to do this is because of the second ability that the boss casts in phase 1, and that is Allure of Flames. Probably know this from heroic. It's the ability which the boss casts, and once the boss finishes his cast, all the fire that is currently on the ground will jump in the air and land on a random raid member's location. Now, the difference in mythic is that every fire patch that jumps also deals around 50k damage to the whole raid. So you can imagine if you just leave the first 10 stacks of fire, assuming that you killed it fast enough, and it jumps, you don't soak it, it will deal 500k to your whole raid. So rip. That is why you need to soak all of the fire every time a Allure of Flames is about to be cast. If the fire is being soaked and there's no fire on the ground currently, then there will be nothing happening from Allure of Flames. That's it. Now, the only hard thing about this is actually assigning people, deal with this fire, and also coordinate where to drop this fire throughout the whole fight. And lastly, to actually heal these players, because the Doomfire debuff, when you soak up the fire, it actually hurts it a lot. So if you have one player taking the first 10 stacks, you need some spam heals on that guy to keep him alive for the 15 seconds of the debuff. Now you can assign your healers to deal with this. You can assign cooldown rotations, external cooldowns. It's up to you. What we used was the hunters because they have great mobility and they don't lose a lot of DPS. So it's a win-win. Any other player that you will put on this job will probably lose more DPS than a hunter, but it's still viable, so it's up to you.
Now the next ability is Dead Brand. This ability actually does not change from the heroic version of this fight. It'll spawn a Hellfire Death Caller, and whoever is marked with a Death Brand will be the guy that's being fixated by the Hellfire Death Caller. This ad will be casting a Shadow Blast, which will be hitting the tank, and several players in the raid, which will deal about 200k damage, and it will increase their shadow damage taken by 25% per stack. Now the tank will obviously get hit by this every single time, so his stacks are going to be increasing. Now the raid members are not likely to get hit a second time, so their stack will most likely drop off. In phase 1 of this fight and phase 1A or 1.5, you're just going to be cleaving these ads down, and the focus should be on the boss and the Doomfires. Every time one of the ads is spawning, you just swap the boss, so the other tank is taking the boss down and one tank is holding the Death Caller. And that's about it for these ads in phase 1. The next ability we have is Shadowfell Burst. Just like in Heroic, this is going to be knocking people up, but unlike Heroic, there's going to be 3 targets initially instead of just 1. You need to be really spread out, and if you're too close to other players, you're gonna get screwed because you don't have enough people to afterwards soak it, because there's already 3 in the air, and if you have another 3 people in the air, that doesn't leave much people to soak, and the damage is increased as well.
And that's all the abilities that the boss will cast in phase 1A, which is from 100% until the boss hits 85%. What you do in phase 1 will determine if you can actually kill the boss. The biggest thing about this phase is, can you push the boss before he casts the 4th Doomfire? And I'll keep in mind that the boss will keep casting Doomfires in phase 1B, so he will keep casting them until 70%. It's a very tight DPS check to actually manage to burn the boss to 70% before he casts his 4th Doomfire, because the 4th Doomfire means that you'll get at least 40 stacks of fire, which is borderline not possible to do. Like, you cannot handle so many fire stacks. Your healers are just gonna be, I'm done, I can't heal this. So this is your number 1 goal, bring the boss down before the 4th Doomfire. And then in order to achieve that, there is actually a small trick. This requires a very tight timing, which will basically extend your DPS check timer by transitioning the boss into phase 1B before he casts his 2nd Doomfire. So, what do I mean? So in phase 1A specifically, you want to only have the boss cast a Doomfire Spirit once. That is basically at the very start of the fight. As soon as you pull the boss, that's the first thing he's gonna cast. Here's the trick. When the boss hits 85% and he transitions into phase 1B, he's gonna delay his Doomfire Spirit cast by a few seconds if you time it properly, because when he enters his phase 1B, he gets new abilities, so he's gonna prioritize that over the Doomfire Spirit. Basically, to make it easy for you to remember, you want to push the boss 85% after he casts his first Shadowfell Burst and before he casts the 2nd Doomfire Spirit. That's your window. You need to push the boss at that timing, and then everything becomes way easier to handle in terms of timing, and again, the DPS check is way less than.
Now, as Roger mentioned, the boss will transition into his phase 1B at 85%. This is when he gains the Desecrate ability. Just like in Heroic, this is going to be spawning the pillar, and the pillar will spawn depending on where the boss is positioned, and if there's any Doomfire spirits up, this will also adjust the pillar location. Now, because we moved the boss to the triangle and next to the moon, the pillar will be spawning right there where we put these marks down. Now, as this first pillar has spawned, you want to move the boss directly north or left if you're looking at it from the entrance, just so it's ready to spawn the 2nd pillar on the left or north side of this one. The boss will be positioned in between these 2 pillars until after the 3rd Doomfire has spawned. Now, while the boss is positioned next to this pillar or in between the 2 pillars, you want to aim the Doomfire spirits towards the entrance side or towards the green marker, just so you leave room for the next pillars to spawn on the north side of the first one. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, these Doomfire spirits will always spawn directly in front of the boss. There's a little variance in how far away they spawn from him. They can be right in front on the red circle or a bit further away, but they're always going to be in front of the boss somewhere.
And it's really important that you actually spawn it properly so that the DPSers can all reach it, and it's not like behind the boss, etc., and making it harder for the DPSers to switch their target and maybe lose 1 or 2 seconds of DPS, which will mean extra Doomfire stacks.
Even if the boss is out of position, you're facing it the wrong way, while the cast is happening you still have time to turn him around and get it in the right position. Now after the second pillar has spawned and you're getting the third Doomfire, you want to aim this Doomfire a bit more south towards the green marker as I mentioned, and then you move the boss directly on top of the cross. This will ensure that the next pillar will be spawning again north side and right next to him, and the ranged DPS will be positioned closer instead of having the pillar spawn towards the exit of the room or far away somewhere else that there's no room to pick up the orbs that their pillars are going to be spawning. Now to go a bit more in depth in these pillars and the orbs that they're spawning, each pillar will be dealing shadow damage while they're up, and even while they're broken they'll be pulsing for shadow damage towards the raid. Now because this damage is going to be increasing the more pillars you get, the raid needs to ensure that they have the Light of the Naru buff. These are the orbs Irel will spawn around the broken pillars once she's broken them down with her ability. Now these orbs will apply a shadow immunity and a movement speed buff to everyone within 15 yards when one person picks up an orb. So if you have the whole ranged camp stacked up and one person jumps into the orb, the whole ranged camp will have it. The same goes for the melee. You can just have one melee assigned to pick up an orb and the whole melee camp should get it. Now once the boss is on the cross, this is the end of the phase 1 precision movement at least. You'll be standing here until you hit the 70% mark, and hopefully you do this before the 4th Doomfire.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, again, top priority, push the boss before that 4th Doomfire spawns. This means no switching to the Death Callers until he actually hits 70%. The only target that the DPS should be switching to are the Doomfire Spirits, and just let the Death Callers be cleaved down by your melee DPS mainly. So once you hit the 70%, you're entering phase 2, which has a lot of different abilities. The boss loses abilities, but before we get to that, let's quickly explain how you actually handle the Doomfires throughout phase 1, because in phase 2 it gets pretty simple, the assignment is pretty clear, but in phase 1 there's a lot of movement of the raid, so it can get a bit complicated to keep your fires where you want them to be. So, from the beginning, as soon as you pull the boss, all the ranged DPSers are standing on the right side of the room. They should be grouped up, and the reason why you want to do this is because the Doomfire Spirit that you will spawn, the first one, right as the fight starts, it's gonna fixate on a random ranged player. And it's way better to have it controlled so that whichever ranged player it's gonna pick and fixate on, it will always start the fire trail towards the same direction. That is why we have all our ranged players stacked up there, and whoever gets fixated just moves towards the entrance of the room. So the fire will always take the same route. This is important because if you don't have that and you have players standing behind the boss or to the left side of the boss, it can happen that a lot of the fire stacks get instantly soaked by the melee DPSers who are trying to kill the Doomfire Spirit or the tanks. Now it's not the end of the world if this happens. All they need to do is just stand right next to the other fire and drop their stacks off so that the actual soaker is gonna pick it up before the Allure Flames is being casted. But yeah, in general, all your ranged grouped up on the right side of the boss and kite the fire towards the entrance. Now once the fire has all been spawned, and ideally you'll have only 10 stacks, we're just gonna say Soaker A, B, and C. For us it was 3 hunters, but again for you it can be whatever you want. So for us, Soaker A goes and soaks all of the fire stacks right before the Allure Flame is being casted, and then he drops them off around the circle marker. So pretty simple, soak it up, go to the circle, drop it off there, and then as soon as that's done, you want all of your ranged players to also spread 8 or 9 yards apart, because you get the Shadowfell Burst at that point. Now as soon as the Shadowfell Burst is done, that's the point where you're gonna push the boss into phase 1B, and you're gonna get the first pillar spawning. Now as soon as you get the first pillar, and hopefully it's at the appropriate location, all of your ranged players again group up in order to get the Light of the Naru buff. Now as soon as that is done, you'll get the second Doomfire Spirit. Again, all your ranged players are grouped up on top of each other on the right side of the boss. You get a Doomfire Spirit, whoever gets fixated, again runs towards the entrance. Pretty simple. Now once the Doomfire Spirit is dead, you need Soaker A and Soaker B to soak the fire yet again before the Allure Flames is being casted. What we did is have the Soaker A soak up the fire that he dropped initially. So she goes and gathers up all of the fire that he dropped off before this Doomfire ever spawned. And then Soaker B picks up the new trail of fire that has just spawned. Now once this has been done, the two Soakers again go back to the group of ranged players and then you refresh your buff by popping a new orb to get the fresh Light of the Naru buff. And as soon as that's done, we say the famous line, spread or die, because there's a Shadowfell burst incoming and you need to spread. Now it's a bit different because we're actually moving the raid from the right side of the boss towards the left side of the boss. You can see it on the video to understand it better, but basically everyone sort of knows after practicing where they go, and that helps keeping it consistent so that you don't have everyone moving together and then panic mode trying to spread out and losing DPS. But that will come easily once you start actually practicing the boss. Now, what do the two soakers do? Well, again, Soaker A drops his fire around the circle marker, and Soaker B drops his fire just on the left side of Soaker A around the diamond marker. Now, as soon as that fire has been dropped, as we mentioned, you get the Shadowfell burst, so everyone is kind of spread out and the raid has kind of moved towards the left side of the boss. And then as soon as the Shadowfell burst has been casted and you've dealt with it, again, everyone groups up on the new pillar that has spawned on the left side of the boss in order to refresh yet again your Light of the Naru buff one last time, basically. At that time, you'll get the third and hopefully the last Doomfire Spirit. And now everyone is gathered towards the left side of the boss. So it doesn't really matter who gets fixated. What he needs to do is just kite the fire again towards the entrance of the room, so that it basically gets mixed together with the other two pools of fire that the first and second soaker have dropped. Now, the last part to actually transition into phase 2 about these Doomfires is that as soon as everyone has refreshed their Light of the Naru buff and you've killed the third Doomfire, you need your third soaker together with the first and the second to go and pick up the fire one last time before they put it in their final location, let's say. So again, we had the first soaker soak the fire that he dropped before, so basically it's the same fire that he soaked from the beginning of the fight. The second soaker, he soaks the fire that he soaked from the second Doomfire, and then the third soaker picks up the new trail of fire that the third Doomfire has spawned. So as you can understand, it's basically first soaker is responsible for the first Doomfire Spirit fire throughout the whole fight. Second soaker is responsible for the second one, and the third one for the third one. That helps keeping it simple so that there's no confusion of who should soak which part of the fire, because it's pretty large, you know, like you have to have some assignment to get all the fire fast. And now, where do they go with this fire? Okay, so here's where it gets quite different. So when they actually soak this fire after the third Doomfire has been killed, you should be almost transitioning into phase 2. And at that point, we had Soaker A drop his fire on the top left corner of the room. The second soaker, we had him drop his fire on the left side of the star, so far left side of the room. And then the third soaker dropped his fire a bit more towards the edge from the diamond marker. So basically it looks like the fire is just on the left side of the room and there's just 3 patches that are separated from each other. Now, this will stay the same for the rest of phase 2. So every time there's an Allure Flame cast in phase 2, again, the first soaker, he will just soak his fire patches and drop them at the exact same location. So yeah, that's basically it. Once you get in this phase, it becomes pretty easy because everyone is just responsible for his pads and that's it. There's no moving around. It's just get your fires, make sure they don't explode, and drop them at the same location. Now, the last thing about these Doomfires, and I know I've been talking a lot, but it's actually the most important thing in this entire fight, so you need to get this down, is that right when you're transitioning into phase 2 and you're getting all the fire that is spawned around the entrance, there might be the case that one of the soakers has like 12 stacks, then the other soaker has 9 stacks, and the third soaker has like 13 stacks. You know, it can become kind of messy because you have the pillars there. Someone might soak fires from someone else's. It can happen. Now, a word of advice is that you should communicate this and actually adjust it the next time that they have to soak. So what we did was just say the number of stacks that we had on our voice comms, and then we just said, for example, oh, I have 9, I'll just take one of yours the next time that we soak. So instead of having, let's say, 10, 10, and 13 stacks, you can have 11, 11, 11, and it will make it easier to heal these targets. I should, of course, mention that every one of these soakers has his one and only soulmate, which is his designated healer. Every soaker will have one healer throughout the whole fight who is going to be focusing on spam healing him for those 15 seconds of the Doomfire stacks. Now it's up to the Soaker and his healer to communicate when they want to use their personal cooldowns, you know, healing tonics, maybe keep an eye on where the healer is so that you don't go out of range. It's gonna be between them to make it somehow work, because yeah, it is not easy to keep them alive. I'll tell you that. You need to use your cooldowns properly in order to survive it.
Thank you, Roger. That was a lot of information about Doomfires there. Now that is out of the way, let's continue with the phase 2 abilities the boss gains and the ones he keeps. First of all, he keeps Allure Flames, as mentioned by Roger, of course. And secondly, he also keeps Death Brands, and he'll be spawning the Hellfire Death Colors continuously until 40%. Now the Hellfire Death Colors become a priority target in this phase. The tanks won't have the Shadow immunity from the debuff that Death Brands gives, and of course they're going to be taking increasing Shadow damage as the Shadow debuff stacks up the longer the ad is up. So this is now the priority in this phase for DPSing.
Yeah, in general, there's a complete different DPS priorities from phase 1 to phase 2. So in phase 1, as I mentioned, it's like nuke the boss, and also of course nuke the Doomfire spirits when they spawn, but that's like very small part of phase 1. Now in phase 2, it's more like nuke everything but the boss, and when everything else is dead, go on the boss. That's basically how it works, because you need to control this phase. It's not just nuke the boss down, you need to actually handle all of the ads that will spawn.
Now to add a little bit more about the Death Brand, once you transition from phase 1 to phase 2, everyone in the raid is going to be losing their lives to Naru buff, including the tank that's currently tanking one of the Hellfire Death Colors that might still be up. This of course might have stacked up several shadow debuffs already, so this tank needs to watch out that as soon as you transition into phase 2, he's going to need a cooldown to stay alive from those last few ticks that are going to be hitting him before the ad actually gets killed by the raid. Now next up are two new abilities in this phase. These are Shackled Torment and Wrath Chaos. Now the first one, the Shackled Torment, is going to be spawning an image of a player right on top of him. This player is going to be linked with this image until they break their chain that they're linked with. This chain will break if you move further than 30 yards away, and when that happens, the image will blow up in a 25-yard radius and it'll kill anything that's basically left in there, with the exception of other players that are affected by the Shackled Torment. Because while you're affected by Shackled Torment, you'll be immune to any other explosions that might happen on top of you. Now whoever is chained to his Shackled Torment will be taking damage every second, and this damage is going to be increasing the longer they are chained. So you can't just sit there and keep the chains alive forever, because they're going to be dying eventually. Now unlike in Heroic and Mythic as mentioned, these chains and Shackled Torments, they'll blow up in a 25-yard radius. In Heroic it hits everyone in the raid for minor damage, but here in Mythic it'll blow up in a 25-yard radius for several millions of damage, so you're not going to be surviving it. This is why every time Shackled Torment actually spawns, there's going to be a countdown by the raid leader, and after that countdown ends, everyone needs to be outside of the 25-yard blow-up radius. Because once this countdown ends, the players chained to their images are going to be breaking the chains and blowing up in the 25-yard radius. Now the next ability is the Wrath Chaos. In Heroic this works only like one player is targeted and you shoot one beam to another player, and that repeats a couple of times. But now in Mythic, everyone in the raid is going to be targeted by either the beam or they're going to be the one shooting the beam. So there's going to be 10 beams in total in the whole raid every single time it jumps. This beam will jump 3 times and it will jump every 6 seconds.
Yeah, so this is like the main mechanic of phase 2. If you handle this mechanic properly and you don't have people getting hit by multiple lasers at the same time from poor positioning, then you're going to progress through phase 2 quite fast. Now, how do you actually manage that? Because 10 lasers, oh god. Well, in all honesty, there's literally no way you can handle this without some sort of add-on helping you. After progressing through the fight, we came up with what I think is the best way to handle this laser. That is with the great help from a weak aura. Now, what this weak aura will do is it will have a small radar on your UI that will show all of the laser lines from the people who are linked with each other. Now, although this weak aura is pretty easy to understand just by looking at it, let's quickly explain what it actually shows. So your beam, because of course you're gonna have your own beam, is marked by a blue line. So that's fine, you cannot avoid that. Every other line is gonna be marked as a green line. But if you actually are standing inside one of the other lines, the green line will turn into red. That means that if you stand there, if no one moves, you're gonna get a double hit and you're probably gonna die, because each one of these lasers deals like 200k damage. So you get hit by 2, that's 400k, that's basically your whole HP. So when you see a red line, all you need to do is step out of it try not to move too much, because if you move too much, then you're probably going to move your line on top of someone else, and then they will have to move, etc., etc., and it will be just a chain reaction and a lot of panic. So all you need to do is make small movements, and ideally you want to make those movements on your line. So on your blue line, if you move either forward towards your linked player or away from him, but always on that line, your line is not going to move, so you're not going to affect anyone else. But it doesn't matter too much as long as you just avoid the red line. Just avoid it, minimal movement, and you're good to go. Now, what about positioning? What we did is, if you look at the marks, we had the boss standing on the cross. Obviously, the melees are standing right behind him. And then half of our ranged players were standing between the blue mark and the moon mark. And then the rest of our ranged players were standing between the circle and the diamond. So basically you have half the raid on the right side of the boss, half on the left side of the boss. How they actually position exactly between these two markers, it doesn't have to be strict. You don't have to form a strict line between these two markers. It's actually not that good if you have a strict line. It's basically, again, just like I mentioned before, just get used to it, find the positions that work for you, and that's it. The only thing that is kind of important is that your soakers that are soaking the Doomfire are standing close to it. So for example, your soaker A should be standing close to the blue mark and not the moon mark, because then he will have to move way more. So yeah, just stand next to your fire patches. And then soaker B and C, they need to be close to the diamond marker. Everyone else doesn't really matter. Again, just try the fight and see what fits you. If someone has trouble with a certain location, then just swap around. Yeah, it's basically up to you. Now, the only ones who should have a bit of trouble are the melees, because they're standing in between the two groups, basically. So, as you can imagine, a lot of the lasers are going to be passing through the melee. Now, thankfully, you probably have a few rogues, and because they're rogues, they basically don't give a shit about these lasers. They're like, nothing. All they need to do is just press their feint button and just stand still. They can take like 3 hits. It's fine. So if you're a rogue, even if you have like 2 red lines passing through you, just feint and stand still, because if you move, you might actually move your line and hit someone else. So it's better if you just stand still. But for the rest of your melees, you need to be really careful. Like, focus on that 100%, because it's way more likely that you will die than a ranged player. Now, you might think, wow, this weak aura is amazing, but we even went a step further, and we actually implemented the Shackle Torments on the same radar. So, once the Shackle Torments are spawned, you will see 3 big circles on that radar, and you can clearly see if you're inside one of the circles or if you're safe. Again, by the circle being green, means you're safe. If it's red, it means you're inside of it, and you need to get out. It also shows a number of the players who are inside the circle, so that when that hits 0, it means that no one is inside, so you can safely blow it up. If it has players inside it, it will show the number of them, and yeah, you need to be careful there. Now, if you get the Shackle Torment yourself, the circle is going to be a different color, and you're actually going to have 2 circles on top of each other. One will be 25-yard radius, which is the explosion range, and the other one will be 30-yard radius, which is how far you have to move in order to blow it up. Basically, this weak aura makes it handle both of the mechanics way easier just by looking at this radar. You cannot really mess it up once you get used to it.
Now, outside of this weak aura, we also made some movement adjustments to make it easier to avoid the Shackle Torments for the whole raid. Now, for the first Shackle Torment, these will be spawning after the first Rat Chaoses are done jumping, and once they spawn, the raid leader can do a start a countdown, and the whole raid will move towards the star positioning. We'll just gather on top of the star until we move back after the shackles have been broken. So after the first shackles have been broken, you start moving back towards the cross, and then once you are back in positioning, you're gonna get ready for the second Rat Chaos. This time, the Shackle Torment is going to be spawning during the Rat Chaos, so you're going to be waiting until the Rat Chaoses are all done jumping, and that's when the raid leader starts the countdown to move towards the star again. Now, once the second Shackle Torments have been broken, the raid will just wait at the star until the third Shackle Torment are actually going to be spawning. There's no Rat Chaos in between the second and the third Shackle Torment, so you wait at the star until you get Shackle Torment, and then after you get the Shackle Torment, again the raid leader starts the countdown and you move back to your original positions towards the cross and the other raid markers. Just make sure you move away and outside of the circles once you're moving away from these positionings. This is what's most important about the Shackle Torments. As long as you're outside of the circle, no matter where you are moving, you're going to be safe from the blow-ups. even if you're out of position and you can't make it to the star as you have to run through everything, you can always decide to go to the other side for a second and wait till they're broken before moving towards the raid. Now around the time of the third Shackle Torment while the whole raid is gathered on the star, this is when you're going to be hitting 55% and you'll be entering phase 2B. This is when ads are going to be running into the room, and we'll be explaining them later after we finish explaining the Shackle Torment movements. To continue, as you've moved back after the third Shackle Torment and there's now ads spawning in the room, after this, for each Shackle Torment, there's a general rule of thumb that if there is Rat Chaos and you get Shackle Torment, you wait for the rats to finish and then the raid leader does a countdown, and if there's no Rat Chaos, the raid leader can just start a countdown as soon as they've spawned. We're not moving to any special positions anymore after this point. We're just going to be letting the raid move freely outside of the circles, and they just have to find the quickest position to a safe spot, and then afterwards they move back to positioning for the Rat Chaos.
Yeah, it's especially important that the tanks find the closest location that they can move towards to avoid these Shackle Torments, because as you can understand, if they move too far away, then he's gonna go out of range for the healers and the range DPSers, and also the melees are gonna have to follow him. So yeah, in general, just look at your radar, the weak aura, and try to find the fastest way out of the Shackle Torments. Just go towards there. As soon as they blow up, move back to your original position, the cross. Now let's move on to the actual ads in phase 2B. So once you hit 55%, the gates of the dark portal are going to be opened up and all hell will break loose. Well, it's not that big of a deal, to be honest. So what do you actually get? You get two kinds of ads. First one is the Fellborn Overfiend, and it will come one at a time, and it only has one ability, and that is the Heart of Argus. You can completely and easily avoid this. Now this Fellborn Overfiend will cast this ability every time it loses 25% of its HP. So at 75% it will cast it once, at 50%, 25%, and then it's dead. So 3 times it will cast it. Now because it has so little HP, if you nuke it down, it won't even cast it 3 times, it will cast it like twice, maybe even once. And you can actually interrupt the cast, stun the ad, like just basically play around with it. All you need to do basically is assign 2 sets of interrupters. You can just put all of your interrupters there, it doesn't really matter. And just have, let's say, like 3 or 4 people responsible to interrupt the first cast and 3 or 4 people for the second cast. Like, it should not get the third cast off. You can just burst it down in like 5 seconds. Now what does this cast do? If it gets finished, it will actually deal around 200k damage to the whole raid. So pretty massive. You need to interrupt it. Now what about the second type of ads? These are the Dreadstalkers, just like in Heroic, but this time in Mythic there's a difference. You get 6 of them instead of 3. Yay! Well, not really, because they're super annoying, especially for the casters. Now what they will do is an ability called Consume Magic. Basically what this means is that they'll just teleport on a ranged player's location, and small side note, they cannot blink to a hunter because he is not considered a caster, and they will start casting their ability Consume Magic, which once it's done, they will explode in the small circle that they mark as soon as they blink, and anyone who is inside it gets again like 150k or so damage, and also gets interrupted if he is casting. So all you need to do is just step away from it. And that's about it. Now the tricky part is when you get these ads, when you have the lasers as well, the Rod Chaoses, because as I explained before, you can't just randomly move around because your laser is gonna hit someone else, or you are gonna step into someone else's laser and you're gonna get destroyed. You can choose to just stand still and take the damage, take the hit from the Dreadstalkers instead of moving. If you use like a personal cooldown, that's fine. But yeah, in general, just try to keep your movement at a minimum. You don't want to just run around panicked and kill everyone else just to avoid these Dreadstalkers. Now, other than that, they do single target attack players. They're not actually aggro based, so they will just attack randomly targets. You don't really need any tank to pick them up. It's just something to annoy you, and you just need to kill them off. Great classes to kill these off are the Moonkins, because they just dot them all up, and Death Knights, because they can spread their diseases, and also Shadow Priests. Now, these Dreadstalkers and the Overfiends, as soon as you hit 55%, you'll get both of these. So 1 Overfiend and 6 Dreadstalkers right at the beginning. Now, after the first wave, they will still spawn, but the Dreadstalkers spawn roughly twice as fast as the Overfiends. But it's not exact, so there's gonna be some difference. So you might get like Dreadstalkers, and then Dreadstalkers again, and then 5 seconds later an Overfiend. Doesn't really matter, to be honest. All you need to do is make sure you interrupt the Overfiends, dot up the Dreadstalkers, and that's it. Avoid the circles on the ground.
Now it's important for the tanks to remember when the overfiends are spawning. Putting this on emphasize is a good idea, so you know like when it's coming up and you need to be ready to pick it up. Whichever tank is tanking the boss and doesn't have a death color on him should most likely pick it up, just because the death color is the one that's hurting the most in this fight. Stunning the ad into the melee range of the boss is really important, just because the interrupters might not be in range to actually kick it if it loses enough health to start a cast.
Yeah, a good idea is to also use some misdirects on it if you have the hunters placed on that side of the room. Now this phase ends at 40% when you go into the last phase, phase 3. But before we go there, let's quickly say how you handle the Doomfire stacks on the ground. As I mentioned, it's pretty simple in terms of movement, but it's actually harder to stay alive because of the timing with the Rot Cases and the Suckle Torments. So what do? You have the 3 soakers that are standing relatively close to their fire stacks. Now you're gonna have to soak these fires 4 times throughout phase 2, and the timings get harder and harder the longer you are in phase 2. So the first time that you have to soak is right after the first Rot Chaos. You have plenty of time to do so. You have like 10 seconds to pick it up. So it's pretty simple. You just wait for the lasers to be done, pick up your fire, drop it at the same location, move back into position for the next lasers. The second time, it's gonna be again the same, but keep in mind that you might have a Suckle Torment yourself, so you need to be careful with blowing it up. You can't just run away from it to soak your fire and blow it up before the countdown. Or you can already be positioned next to your fire, so you can actually start picking it up without blowing up your Suckle Torment, even if the countdown is not done yet. You can just stand in it and then blow it up. Again, you have relatively enough time after the lasers are done to do this soaking, but it's a bit less. So instead of having 10 seconds before the boss starts casting Allure Flames, now you have, let's say, around 6 seconds. Now the third time is when it starts getting pretty close. So again, it's the same. You wait for the third lasers, and then as soon as they are done, as soon as the third laser has been shot, you need to instantly start soaking, because at that point you have like 3 seconds before the boss starts casting Allure Flames, and the cast is like another few seconds. So yeah, you have roughly 5 or 6 seconds at that point. So you need to be really fast. And then the last time, the 4th time, is when it's actually the hardest. And at that point we actually changed it so that instead of the 2 hunters, so instead of Soaker B and C being hunters, we actually swapped them out and put mages there instead, because they can just use their immunity to soak all of that damage. The reason why we do this is because you actually have to start soaking during the Rot Chaoses. Cannot wait, because the boss will cast Allure Flames right when the lasers are done, so there's no time after it. So what we did is, when the 4th Rot Chaoses appear, you wait for the first time for them to jump, and then when the second time is about to hit, we used some external cooldowns on these players so that it minimizes the damage that they get from that laser. And then as soon as the second jump happens, they start soaking. And while they're soaking, you're gonna get the third hit from the lasers. And at that point, you cannot really care about the lines. You just have to go for it, use a personal cooldown, and just take the damage. Everyone is aware that that is the panic mode. That is the hardest part of the fight, and it's right before you transition into phase 3. So use your personal cooldowns there, try to survive and do your best, because yeah, the timing is really clutch. Now, once you've dealt with the fire, the 4th Allure Flame is done. At that point, you can just ignore the fire and just group up on the boss. Everyone groups up on the boss, not just the soakers. Everyone should group up on the boss, because at that point you need to push the boss. You cannot wait. Your DPS needs to be high enough, and it should be, if everyone is alive, to transition the boss into phase 3 before you get anything else. And you have quite a lot of time to do that. Now, why would you gather up? That is because you want to kill off any adds that you have before entering the next phase. And you want to do that because, unlike any other boss in any expansion, even though you change the room in phase 3, the adds that you have actually follow you. So you need to kill them off so that you can start DPSing the boss in phase 3 instantly. That is why you group up, so the Dreadstalkers are more grouped up and you can clip them off. Again, the last thing about this phase is that when the boss is around 40%, so let's say 41%, 42%, you should check the death collar timer, because that's the next ability that he will be casting, and you just want to push him before the death collar has been spawned, but maximize the time that you have so that you finish off all the ads. It's very important.
So once the boss hits 40%, hopefully you've finished off all the ads that are there remaining. If you don't, it's okay. You still have time once you land down in the last phase to actually kill some of them off. Having a death collar is really shit, so that's the only thing you really need to avoid. All the other ads is not a super big deal, and you can still just transition as long as you do it before the death collar. Now what happens when you reach 40%? First of all, the boss is going to be casting Nether Ascension. This is a cast of a few seconds, and everyone who is in the room, even the dead people, will be ported down into the Twisting Nether. This will look like the room that you've seen in the heroic mode when you go down into the portal in the last phase. It looks around the same, but there's minor differences. The first thing that you might notice is that the boss will be healed to 50%. I guess Blizzard didn't want the fight to be short, so they added another 10% health on top of the boss. Now Archimonde is going to get a total new toolset of abilities that he's going to be doing. He doesn't keep any of the previous ability that he had. This is a complete new phase, a new fight basically. You're going to be doing this until the end, until he hits 0%. There's no early deaths this time around either.
Yeah, trust us. We believed in the 20%, the 10%, the 5%, even the 2%, but no. You actually need to hit 0% to kill this boss.
Yep, there's no wisps in the Twisting Nether to save us this time. Now the first ability that the boss will be casting in this phase is Dark Conduits. He'll give you a couple of seconds to spread out and position yourself in the room, and then that's when he's going to be casting Dark Conduit 3 times. This will place a conduit on top of a random ranged player, and if this player places another conduit on top of the existing one, this will blow the existing one up and it'll deal heavy damage towards the raid. Conduit spawning will also deal damage to anyone near that place where it just spawned, and since it's on a ranged player, it'll always deal damage to that player.
Because it's the start of the phase and it's the easiest part, you want to place these dark conduits as far away as possible towards the corners of the room. So go to your far right, far left. Basically, don't spawn them anywhere close to the middle, because if you spawn them in the middle, it's very likely that you'll get them exploding with later spawns of them. Now, the only good news about this ability is that it cannot target the same player twice. Every time the boss casts this ability, he will cast it 3 times back to back. So he casts one Dark Conduit, then as soon as it's done, another one, then another one. So it comes in packs of 3. But it cannot target the same player throughout these 3 spawns. So if you get one Dark Conduit on top of yourself, you don't have to move away from your Dark Conduit in fear that it will spawn another one on top of you. You're safe, you can just stand still, that's fine. You did your job, you spawned it, and you don't have to move. Of course, if there are 2 people standing on top of each other and one guy spawns the first Dark Conduit and then the second one spawns the other one on top of each other, that's not good. So yeah, just be careful.
Now moving on to the next ability, this is the Void Star ability. When the boss casts this is going to be spawning 5 Void Stars. These are the same Void Stars you have in the other difficulties of the fight, down into the Twisting Nether phase. This is an orb that's going to be fixating on one player and it's going to be moving towards him and speeding up as it does that. And once it reaches that player, it will be blowing up and pushing everyone back around it with a huge knockback, so they're likely going to be flying off the platform. When this is cast, these stars will always spawn in set locations in the room. This is why you can have 5 groups of players, or 5 individuals even, because one player is usually enough to kill them, to focus these stars down before they reach any of the targets. 2 will be spawned in the melee range, and there will be 3 other stars that are going to be further away from the boss, and ranged players will have to focus them.
Yeah, keep in mind that these stars, they will only blow up if they reach the target who they are fixated towards. So you don't have to be afraid of getting hit by one of those stars if you don't have the fixate debuff yourself. That means that the melees can actually also DPS these, but they don't have that much HP, so even one ranged DPSer should be enough to kill it. And of course, just like in Heroic, you can always slow these stars, but you cannot stun them.
A good thing to note is that the Void Stars that are spawning in melee never have fixated any of our melee DPSers, so they're free to just instantly attack them instead of waiting for the fixate first. The next ability on our list is the Source of Chaos. When the boss casts Source of Chaos, he'll be spawning a crystal right in front of him in the middle of the room. This Source of Chaos will be focusing on the tank that was currently tanking the boss with the highest threat, and it'll be pushing back that tank with a beam of chaos, you can say. This beam will be dealing damage towards anyone who's standing in it, and it'll also reduce the pushback on the tank depending on the amount of players that are in it. So what we had done was have 2 rogues standing inside of this beam as they are taking damage and stacking up the debuff, which will increase the damage taken from it. But since they're rogues, they can just feint and cloak the stacks off whenever needed and wanted. Tank that's being pushed back, just make sure that he doesn't fall off the platform and gets pushed back towards the end of the room, as there's the longest distance before you fall off. There's also a rock actually in the back of the room that you can just position yourself against and you can't even fall off at all, but you might be out of range for healers when you're doing that. To get rid of this source of chaos, everyone just targets it and kills it as soon as it spawns, unless there's other adds up that have priority first. The next ability we have is Reign of Chaos. This is actually an ability also uses sort of in the other difficulties. It'll spawn down a rain of meteors, and when these meteor lands, they're going to be spawning Infernal Doombringers. There's going to be increasing amounts of Infernal Doombringers spawning every time he does this. Well, not exactly every time he casts this, but every several waves they're going to be increasing in number. The first 2 waves will be 3 Infernal Doombringers, then the next 3 waves will all be 4 Infernal Doombringers, and then there's one last wave with 5 Infernal Doombringers, which we're actually not even going to be killing. Now, how this Reign of Chaos works is that every circle on the ground is going to be dealing damage depending on the distance you are from that impact. So as a melee DPS, for example, you don't want to stand in the circle. The same goes for range, you just want to step outside of it and move more if you can, but don't move too far that you waste too much DPS. Now, once these Infernals have landed, you need to kill them as soon as you can, because just like in the other difficulties, they will be healing if they are close to each other, and once they reach 100 energy, they will be pulsing with heavy AoE damage, and you cannot let that happen for too long. Now, because the positioning in this phase will be assigned in 4 groups, there's a high chance that these Infernals might fall on top of each other if you don't spread out before the Reign of Chaos. If this happens, you might want to have a Death Knight to grip them away, or a Moonkid knock, or an explosive trap even in worst case scenarios, but you have to be careful with uncontrollable knockbacks, just because you might knock them into some other Infernal again.
To be honest, this is the hardest mechanic. We wiped to this the most out of all of them. So the key to handle it easily is to spread them apart as fast as possible. Because the more that these Infernals heal each other, the more likely it will be that you're not going to have enough DPS, kill them before they reach 100 energy, and if they pulse their AoE for even like 2 seconds, you might have some Reaperinos in the raid. To make it a bit easier, because these Infernals are aggro based, but you have your ranged DPSers just nuking them down, like you have your Warlocks just spamming their Chaos Bolts, and yeah, you can easily steal aggro from these Infernals. The easiest way to handle this is imagine the room in a square, and well, the first 2 waves that only have 3 Infernals are pretty easy to handle. I mean, you shouldn't have too much difficulty with that, but the most important ones are the 4 Infernal waves. Ideally, you want to have 1 Infernal being taunted by the tanks, and by the way, the tanks are standing in the top left corner, so on the left side of the boss. One of them gets taunted towards there, and then one is getting taunted by a DPS warrior or being gripped by a Death Knight on the right side of the boss, where the melees are standing. And then there are 2 more Infernals that should be destructing shotted from your hunters, one on the back right of the room and one on the back left of the room. That way you form basically a square with the 4 Infernals, and none of them is healing each other, and you just kill them off pretty easily. Of course, you can have the very unlucky time where you get all 3 or all 4 of them spawning on top of each other, and can be a big mess, because yeah, you don't even know which one to grip, which one to distracting shot. It can be messy, but as long as you have relative spread, you shouldn't have this happen. The last thing is that these Infernals are stunnable and are knockable, as we mentioned, so you need to be really careful to not stun them on top of each other. If you, for example, throw a binding shot, which the hunters should do when they have their Infernal separated, but if you throw the binding shot and it gets stunned next to another Infernal, then it becomes really sketchy, because then you can't even move it away. Also, as we mentioned, be careful with your aggro. If the Infernal, for example, doesn't die in time, it might start running towards another ranged DPSer, because the distracting shot doesn't last forever. So just be careful. And then lastly, you should definitely assign some DPS cooldowns for these waves. So again, the first 2 waves, they have 3 Infernals each. Pretty easy to handle even without cooldowns, but the next 3 waves, so wave number 3, 4 and 5, that you actually need to kill, and you get 4 Infernals in each one of them, you really need to have assigned some cooldowns. So for example, you can say, okay, personal DPS cooldowns on the third one, and then maybe DPS potions on the next one, and then maybe Bloodlust for the last one. I mean, just see how the timing is for you guys and come up with an assignment that actually kills them in time. Then we have 2 more abilities that the boss casts. One of them is Seething Corruption. Now this will probably remind you of other bosses like Hagen from back in Extremis. So basically what is this? It's just flame on the ground and you need to avoid it and dance with it. It will come just like Dark Conduit in waves of 3. So some part of the room is gonna light up with some green sparkles, and after a couple of seconds it blows up. If you stand in it, you're dead, unless you have like an immunity or something. And then after that first blow up has been done, immediately after, a different part of the room is gonna light up with the green sparkles again, and it will blow up again after a couple of seconds. And then this happens a third time. All of that happens in the span of like 6 or 7, 8 seconds. You just have to constantly be moving away from it, basically. There is a way to handle this easily, because it's not totally random where this fire spawns. There are 4 specific patterns. We did figure out all of these patterns and have made a picture where you can see all of them, as you can see right now on your screens, and there will also be a link from this picture in the description below. And basically you have the 4 different patterns. We have named them, sort of, and as long as your raid leader knows by seeing the first sparkles of each pattern, if he knows which pattern it is and he can call it out. So for example, if you get the famous vagina pattern, you can call it out and you can say left and then right. So after the first tick, all the raid has to move to the left of the boss, and then for the last tick, they have to move to the right of the boss. So as long as you have your raid leader call it out, it's really easy to dodge. It's not very hard. The only one that is sort of hard is the fucked up one, as we call it, because the last tick of it, you have to actually move away from the boss. You go to the far back of the room, and your melees are actually very, very sad because they cannot attack the boss. Now there is another small detail about these patterns, and that is that it is random which ones you get, but the boss will always cast all 4 of these patterns before going again in a new cycle of them. So if you get, let's say, the fucked up one as the first pattern of Seething Corruptions, there is no way that you're gonna get it again for number 2, 3, and 4 of the Seething Corruptions. This means that once you've had your first 3 patterns, you basically know which one will be the last one. As you can see also from the picture, the general idea is that the first tick of each pattern, it has a lot of free room, so it's pretty easy to dodge no matter where you're standing. But then on the second tick you have less room, and on the third tick you basically have only one patch where you can be standing.
If you get any of the fucked up patterns that there's no spot in melee to stand, tanks can just use a cooldown and actually survive it while still being in the boss's melee range to avoid any random melee deaths for being out of melee range, and then the boss will hit a melee or something.
Yeah, and that leads us to the final ability, which is the one that is being casted most often in this phase, and that is the Marks of the Legion. These are debuffs that 4 random players in the raid will get, and it can be anyone except the tanks who get these debuffs. Now these debuffs, when they expire, they blow up on that person and 10 yards around them, and each one of them will have a different duration. One of them will have 5 seconds duration, then another one will have 7, then the other one will have 9 and 11. So you basically have 4 debuffs that explode with an interval of 2 seconds. Now if one player stands by himself and when this debuff expires he takes all of the explosion, he's just gonna die unless he has some kind of immunity. Now the way you handle this is by having people be close to this player and take some of that damage, because it gets split amongst all the players that are standing close to this guy. The other part about this debuff is that when this explosion happens, the person who has the debuff is gonna get knocked backwards depending on the way that he is facing. So it doesn't matter where the boss is, all that matters is where your character is facing, and you're gonna get knocked backwards from that location. The rest of the people also get knocked that are standing inside the explosion range, but this time they don't get knocked depending on the way that their character is facing, but instead they get knocked depending on the position that they are standing relative to the person exploding. If it makes it easier for you to understand, just think of it like the smash that Blackhand did in Blackrock Foundry. So depending where the tank was standing, you stood in the circle and you get knocked away from the center of the circle. The center of the circle is the guy exploding. Now, this knockback, the more people that are standing inside this explosion, the less the knockback will knock you. So if you have like 5 players taking the explosion, which is the ideal, you have 20 players. So for 4 explosions, you have 5 each. Then the explosion will knock you back very little. But if you have, let's say, 3 people, you might actually get knocked off the platform. So you need to be careful with this. Now, the last thing about these Marks of the Legion is that when the person explodes with it, anyone who gets hit will also get the new debuff, which increases the damage taken by Mark of Legion explosions by 600%. So this makes it clear that you cannot soak more than 1 Mark of the Legion at a time. You cannot just soak one and then run to the other and soak that one as well. You're just gonna die. So what we did is we just formed a square by having 5 players in each corner of that square. One corner of this square being the tank spot, the top left, the other one being the melee spot, the top right, and then 2 ranged groups accordingly in, let's say, the middle right and middle left of the room. Now, if you don't have enough melee, you can of course have some ranged players move into the melee groups and just sign them there. Now, the last thing about this Mark of the Legion is that you need to coordinate which Mark of the Legion guy goes into which corner of these 4 groups, because you could have 4 people from the same corner get the debuffs. So what do you do then? And to deal with this, you have to use some kind of add-on, no matter what. We have a weak aura that we used that tells you which corner you should go, like melee right, melee left, range right, range left. That makes it easy. And we will link it in the description below, but you need to adjust it to your own raid, because the way that this particular weak aura works is it takes the info from the angry assignments. If you have your own weak aura, go ahead and use that, but if you want, we will have it in the description below if it helps you. Just keep in mind that you can't just take this weak aura and it will work for you. You need to actually adjust it and have the angry assignments as well.
And with these knockbacks from the Mark of the Legions, as Roger mentioned, since you get the debuff that'll increase your damage taken from the next explosion by 600%, you cannot get knocked into another group if they still have to blow up as well. So if, for example, you're the group that blows up with a debuff with 5 seconds, and you get knocked into the group that's about to blow up with a 7-second debuff, you don't have time to run back, and you're gonna just get knocked into the other group and instantly blow up and get knocked away, and you just die from the damage you take as you get knocked into that group. So when you're positioning yourself around the person with the Mark of the Legion, make sure you take a position that you get knocked towards the middle of the room or towards the edge of the room, as long as you don't fall off. Another thing to note for the tanks is that once you get knocked back, there's a risk that you get knocked back out of the melee range of the boss, and then the boss will smack a different target than the initial highest threat target. So if that happens, a melee might die from you not being in the melee range. So make sure you get knocked and you land in the melee range of the boss. Now these were all the abilities that the boss will be casting in the last phase, and each one of them, like if you would get these abilities one by one, it would actually be a pretty damn easy phase, and you'd be like one-shotting this as soon as you get into here, unless people fuck up the Mark of the Legions. Now because that of course would be too easy, the developers actually haven't given these abilities like a cooldown. They actually gave it set timers, so these abilities will be conflicting with each other and you're going to get more and more abilities at the same time the longer you're in this phase. For example, the first time this is going to be conflicting is when you are getting Reign of Chaos, the Infernal Doombringers are landing down, and shortly after you're going to be getting the Seething Corruption. So you have to move while still finishing off the Infernal Doombringers. If you're not fast enough, these Infernal Doombringers are going to get forced to move on top of each other because the whole raid will be trying to avoid the dance that is happening. Another example is that when Seething Corruption is happening and right after it ends, or right before it ends even, the boss is going to be casting Dark Conduits or Mark of the Legion, and the raid has to spread out or take their positions right as the Seething Corruption ends. So really you have to be careful with these combinations that are going to be happening to you. The only ability in this phase that are actually not dangerous when it happens together with everything else, it's pretty much the Source of Chaos. Because first of all, the tank can just go and hit the brick at the end of the room and he'll never fall off, so the DPS doesn't have to focus it at that time. And secondly, it only really actually hits the tank and the 2 rogues that are trying to save the tank, and that's it. All the other abilities do things to the raid or they deal damage, and you really have to handle them properly.
Yeah, this last phase actually seems very hectic when you start getting used to it, but once you start understanding the timings of all of these abilities, it will become, let's say, second nature, and you will know these timings by heart. And if you have your raid leader actually calling all of these out and also helping you with the dances, it's actually not that hard of a fight. The only things that can basically instantly wipe you are Dark Conduit explosions. So be careful. As we mentioned, you might get one of those dances, the Soothing Corruption, and right after, you're getting the Dark Conduits. So spread out, make sure you don't stand on top of previous Dark Conduit, and yeah, that's it. And the second one that can wipe you is the Infernals. Handle them properly, kill them in time, and you're not gonna wipe. All of the other abilities, you might have a random death here and there, but it shouldn't really cause a wipe. What will cause a wipe is actually not killing the boss in time, because we mentioned you get 2 waves of 3 Infernals each, then you get 3 more waves of 4 Infernals each, and then the 6th wave will spawn 5 Infernals. Now at that point, it's almost impossible to kill those Infernals. So what you need to do is just kill the boss before that ever happens. Or well, you can have them land, but you cannot waste time DPSing them. You just need to kill the boss that time before they reach 100 energy. That's basically your end rage of this fight. So it's very important that you maximize your damage on the boss itself. That's why you need to use Bloodlust in this phase. You can use Bloodlust at the start of the fight, because it actually is longer than 10 minutes. But if you see that you don't really need Bloodlust on the pool to make the DPS check with all the legendary rings now, then you can just save it and use it on the last phase whenever you feel like it's the best time, instead of just having it at the very end. Now that's all of the fight. There are just a few tips and tricks that will help you with all of these phases. First of all, it's very advisable for all your DPSers, well, especially the ranged DPSers, to use some form of targeting macro. This will help you a lot in phase 1 because the hitbox of the boss is insanely big. It's pretty hard to actually target the ads in phase 1 and phase 2. So just having a targeting macro which prioritizes the targets. So for example, you can have it first of all target the Doomfires, then you can have it target the Deathcallers or the Overfiends. Even in the last phase, you can have it target the Source of Chaos. This will make your DPSer's life a lot easier in this fight. Just have a good macro. We will have one in the description below, and you can use that one if it fits you, or just change it to whatever you want, whatever your priority of killing ads is. The second tip is, hopefully, if you're trying to kill Archimonde, your whole raid has the legendary ring by now. You should try to use it at key moments in the fight to make your life easier. What we end up using now, but of course this could be different depending on your raid DPS, is first of all, use the ring to kill off the second Doomfire. Watch the timer and pre-use it, basically right when you get your first Shadowfell burst, and then as soon as the second Doomfire will spawn, it will blow up and almost instantly kill it. This will ensure that you get only 10 stacks from that Doomfire, which is very important. And then in the last phase, you can use the ring to blow up the Infernals. Just have someone who knows how to do it, and it will make your life a lot easier. Another tip for the last phase this time is that the Marks of the Legion, you can actually solo them, as I mentioned. So, for example, the Hunter can Deterrence, the Mage can Ice Block, and you can use a lot of things to actually solo these marks. The only thing you need to keep in mind though is that you still get knocked. So even if you don't die from the damage, you need to have a way to not get knocked off the platform, because if you're soloing this, you're gonna get knocked in China. So make sure that you have some sort of blink or disengage, something to stay on the ground.
Now, 2 last special meta tips and tricks is, first of all, you can sacrifice the tanks on the Deathcallers at the end of phase 2, and if you let the tank die, the Deathcaller will also despawn, so you don't have to DPS it at all, and it will give you some more room to finish off any ads. The second place you can sacrifice tanks is in the last phase. If a tank is focused by the Source of Chaos, you can let him again die, and you can res him up if he uses the rock in the back of the room, and it'll despawn the Source of Chaos, so no one has to tank it or soak the beam. Now, there are several debuffs in this fight you want to keep track of, as always. The first debuff is Doomfire Fixate. When you're fixated by the Doomfire, you'll have to run the fire towards the entrance of the room, so you need to make sure that you know that you are actually the one being fixated by it. The second debuff is Doomfire. This is from the fire itself. When you pick it up and you have an amount of stacks from Doomfire on you, and when it runs out, you'll drop the fire again on the ground. If anyone but the assigned soakers picks this up, they need to know that they have the fire on them, and they're gonna have to communicate that they might drop it off somewhere near the actual assigned player so that he can pick it up and put it on the right positions. The next debuff you want to keep track of is Light of the Naru. This is a beneficial debuff that you want to have up at all times in phase 1.b, so you are immune to the shadow damage and you have movement speed increase from the debuff. The next debuff is Shadow Blast. This debuff is only for the tanks. Raid members can also be afflicted by it, but if they are, they don't have to worry about any other bolts hitting them because the chances of that happening is really low.
Then in phase 2, you have 3 more debuffs. The first one is, of course, the Sacred Torment. You get that, wait, don't just run away from it. You need to wait for the raid leader to do the countdown, and once it reaches 0, you need to be 30 yards away from it in order to blow it up. Then you have the Rot Chaos and Focused Chaos, which is basically the same, but you should add both of these debuffs to your tracking. This is just the laser beams in phase 2 that will just give you a timer when the laser is actually gonna hit, so you know when it's time to actually stop moving. Because even if you are standing in 2 lines, you can't just randomly move when they're about to hit. Better to use a personal cooldown and take the 2 lasers, because if you move the last second, you actually might kill other people and they will be really angry, and you don't want that. So moving on into the last phase, you have 2 debuffs there. One is the Mark of the Legion, which we explained right a few moments ago. Just make sure that you have a weak aura for this that actually tells you where you need to move with this. A timer alone does not suffice. You need to actually have assignments for this that the weak aura gives you. And then lastly, you have the Void Star Fixate. This is just to let you know that you are fixated by Void Star. You just need to move away from it. You'll even get like a small link, like a small trail of line between you and the star, so that you even know visually where the star is coming from. It's pretty easy. You shouldn't even need to move if your assigned DPSers are doing their job. And that's it. That's all the debuffs. That's the whole fight. I know that this has been a very long video, but as I mentioned, you basically don't have to learn the whole fight before you actually go to it. All you need to know is step by step each of these phases or even sub phases, and then work your way towards phase 3. So don't feel overwhelmed. Take it one step at a time, and I'm sure you'll end up beating Archimonde and getting the fat loots.
Thanks for watching and following the Mythic Hellfire Citadel video guides, and hopefully we'll all see you in Legion.
Yeah guys, this has been a hell of a ride. We hope that these videos have been helpful to you. And remember to like, comment and subscribe for more video content and of course, video guides in Legion.
We'll see you guys in the next expansion.
Bye bye guys.